Having made my way through the Two Towers and being about halfway through Return of the King, I think I can say the single biggest problem with Tolkien's writing is the pacing. I'm gonna be honest, his pacing is really bad. And this was an issue I had when I read the books back in grade 4 and 5. I read the paperbacks back then, and this time as I'm kind of revisiting it as an adult, I'm listening to the audiobook, and admittedly the audiobook is just a lot better. It makes it easier to kind of go through the boring parts. And I think overall this just is the kind of story and the kind of writing that sounds a lot better when somebody's reading it out than reading it paperback. It's kind of like a Song of Ice and Fire or that sort of thing. But there were certain issues I had with Lord of the Rings when I read it back in grade school. And some of those issues, what I've talked about over the years, are now I think kind of unfair, or maybe I just was too young to appreciate them. But some of the complaints they had, I think, are definitely true, and I can kind of express them a bit better as an adult. I think Tolkien is horrible at pacing. And I think he really needed an editor. I'm not sure if he actually had an editor or not, but if he did, he probably should have fired them. And this is going to irritate a lot of people, this comparison. But Tolkien kind of reminds me a bit of Michael Bay. Michael Bay is a very, very talented director, but he needs someone to put him on a leash. He needs someone, if he's trying to put like black robots in, or like 20-minute explosions, or like shaky cam, he needs someone to just tell him no and be like, no, Bay. Down, boy. You have to. You can't do this. And when he's on a leash, he's really good. Like 13 Hours, The Secret Soldiers of Benghazi is a phenomenal movie. I absolutely loved it. But when Michael Bay isn't on a leash, he makes Transformers 2. So that comparison might offend some people because I'm comparing Michael Bay and Tolkien. But I think it is pretty accurate. These books just scream the need for an editor. Like, it doesn't even need to be like chainsawed at parts, but just a lot of things could be like 20 to 30% shorter. And the other weird thing I find about this is a lot of parts of it I think should be longer and fleshed out more. Tolkien, I just find isn't that good at kind of focusing what I think needs to be focused on for narrative purposes. And once again, I think part of this is just his very whimsical writing style. And there's just certain very specific interests he has, like camping and walking and food and stuff like that, that he just likes to talk about. And he just kind of put his private interests in the book at the expense of the story. So let me just kind of go through some parts that I think he did poorly, that he did well. So parts that were too long, parts that were too short, and parts that were, I guess, about right. So Fellowship of the Ring is by far the most bloated of the three books. I think you could probably cut it down by 20 to 30% and not notice a difference. The part where they're going through the woods just goes on so long. And you have stuff that just happens over and over again. Like you have Farmer Maggot, then you have Tom Bombadil, then you have the Prancing Pony. And it's just so repetitive. You have Bilbo leaving, and then you have Frodo leaving. And it goes on for a really, really long time. And nothing of plot interest happens within it pretty much. Like, you could say there's character development, but Tolkien really isn't that good at characters. That's not something he's really skilled at. I guess the best developed character in the franchise might be Gandalf, but Legolas has no personality. Aragorn has a bit of a personality, I guess, but like most of them, particularly the non-hobbits, don't really have a personality. Like, I find Merry and Pippin very difficult to tell apart, other than the fact that Pippin is the Gondor guy and Merry is the Rohan guy. But other than that, it's really hard to tell them apart. So like, he's not really using this time for character development. Also, people will say, well, you just don't like exposition, but I like exposition. Like when they're at the Council of Elrond and they're talking about like some of the history of the ring, they're talking about the potential plans. I like that thing. If they're talking about Numenor, they're talking about like Gondor's history or like how the war is going. I like that stuff. That stuff doesn't bore me. I don't mind exposition. I like exposition. I like dialogue. My issue is when things happen for like 40% of the book that is not exposition and is not plot related. And that isn't even like dialogue. It's just literally them camping and complaining about supplies and trying to find water. So, like, Fellowship of the Ring, I remember the first, like, 80% of the book not being that good. I guess the Council of Elrond is like when things start to pick up and the writing gets substantially better. Moria was actually pretty well paced. Moria was really interesting, really exciting. The descriptive writing really, I think, played to Tolkien's strengths. I liked the Moria part. It was a teeny bit short, but overall not badly paced. The Two Towers, I think, is probably. It's hard to tell if I'd say The Two Towers or Return of the King is better written. Both of them have the same flaw where a lot of the important stuff gets really rushed, and a lot of the unimportant stuff just gets an inordinate amount of time. So I think the first half of Two Towers is generally pretty good. I feel like they really rush it a lot, though. He's kind of like, okay, we got to get through Helm's Deep. Like, I kind of like the pacing. I thought the movies were paced a lot better. Like, Helm's Deep was kind of the centerpiece of the film. And in the book, it's like one chapter. It doesn't go on very long. It's not particularly epic. I just didn't feel it was particularly well done in the book versus the movie. I mean, the movies, I think, generally speaking, are better than the books in this case. I mean, whenever you're adapting something, a couple different things can go on. It can be much worse. It can be much better. Or it can be, I guess you could say, just generally a good adaptation where they have to make certain changes. Like the Rohirrim charging in at Helm's Deep, it was actually infantry in the book. But for a movie's sake, a bunch of cavalry charging down a hill with Gandalf casting sunlight was much better for film. And it's not really a change that impacted the overall plot very much. But yeah, the whole Rohan part just seemed extremely rushed. They didn't really spend that much time with Theoden. They didn't really spend much time at Helm's Deep. They were just kind of like, Tolkien was just like, we got to get through this. We got to get through this. We don't have time to talk about anything. We don't really have any time to go through the history of Rohan or something. We just got to get back to the camping scenes. And the Meeting Treebeard, that's an interesting kind of adaptation. It's a lot shorter and faster in the books. But once again, the actual destruction of Isengard was pretty quick. Something I like that they expanded a lot more on in the books, that is kind of an example of maybe kind of a slow scene, but one that adds a lot of interesting questions, is when the different orcs are fighting with each other, and the Saruman's orcs have like the white hand nationalism where they hate the other orcs, so they like think they're degenerates. And I thought that was really interesting because it's one of the few times we actually see the orcs display some personality and makes them a little sympathetic. And that's I'm just kind of giving that as an example of a scene where there's not really action or something plot related happening, but it's interesting and it's useful to the story. But overall, the Rohan part just felt really rushed. And then like the second half of the book is I guess the third quarter of it I thought was awful, where they're just going through Ithilien and camping, and Gollum shows up, and they spend like a whole chapter cooking a rabbit, and it just goes on and on and on. And it's just like, okay, we have all this exciting stuff that we're just rushing through, and then the story just kind of hits a brick wall. And like, okay, the overall length of the book isn't really an issue. This part could probably be cut down like 20 to 30%, and you probably could have made the parts in Rohan a bit longer and maybe added some more dialogue or that kind of thing. It's not very even. It just is kind of like super fast or stopped completely. I find there's not really that much of an in between. I don't know if that's just the way Tolkien writes or what he considers important or that kind of thing. But I feel like he just wants to do camping scenes and that kind of thing. And the songs are like that too. The songs I just find are atrocious. The Fellowship of the Ring was the worst Two Towers was pretty bad. Return of the King, they seem to have actually not. He seems to have like come to his senses and not put too many in. But like what it is it's like playing a video game, and every 10 minutes someone hits the pause button and takes the controller away from you for like 2 minutes and then gives it back. And it just takes you out of the story. It takes you out of the world. Just like get back to the frickin' story already. I don't want to hear these crappy songs. I don't want to read this like these horrible things. Just let me let me read the book. It's just I get it that and George R.R. Martin's guilty of this too. He has excessive food scenes. I don't know what it is with medieval writers. The guy who writes Brian Jacques, I think his name is the guy who writes Redwall, is probably the most guilty. It's just not as bad because his books are shorter, but probably like 30% of them are them describing like raspberry cordial and like the various food items they eat. I mean, things get better once Faramir shows up. We actually start to get some like dialogue, and I don't really mind that there's a lot of slow parts there. Like they do go and rest for a while, but we get some really interesting stuff. Like we get Faramir interrogating them, and he has like his really good kind of interrogation techniques, and he figures out everything they're doing by asking like indirect questions. And that was really cool. And just Faramir kind of talking about the war situation. And we have like the commando raid. And I'm like, this is a well-paced part of the book because we have some action, we have some dialogue, we kind of have some slow parts. And like, that's pretty good. But then after that, it just kind of goes back to boring. And that's like the Two Towers. And it's like, it's just very uneven. It's salvageable though, and it's frustrating because I feel like with a little bit of editing, some parts dramatically shortened and some parts somewhat extended, the book could have been made a lot better. Return of the King, I feel like once again, and I'm only about halfway to 2/3 of the way through, and the main plot's resolved itself. Tolkien just really wanted to get to the Scouring of the Shire. Like, that's kind of the centerpiece of this book. Because Pelennor Fields gets resolved pretty quick. But once again, like, I don't mind the scenes in Gondor where Pippin's, like, looking at the city under siege when they're talking to Denethor. Like, that part's slow, but it's, like, interesting. We're getting some, like, character development. We're seeing what the situation's like. I like that part a lot. The Rohirrim part also was fine. It was decently paced. The battle itself was pretty cool. I found it was a little bit rushed, but not too bad. It was kind of weird. I don't, and maybe it was so short. I don't really recall Aragorn, like the Path of the Dead thing really happening that much. It happened off screen. It would have been kind of cool if we had shown more of the Paths of the Dead and like Aragorn talking to them. And then they just go to the Black Gate, and then that part of the story ends. Sam and Frodo going through Mordor, I actually think was really good. That's like the only Sam and Frodo part other than with Faramir I really liked. And I think it's ironically because Tolkien was rushing, he didn't put too much filler in it. So, like in that case, the camping and them scrounging for water and food and stuff served kind of a thematic and plot purpose. It was just showing it's the end of the line. They're basically on a suicide mission at this point. They have no real hope of getting anywhere or returning. And I like that. I think that part of the book was really good. And so we're going to head into but it's like the book's half over and the main plot's resolved. Sauron's dead. The ring's destroyed. I'm like, what are they going to do for the remaining 50% of this book? And I know the Scouring of the Shire is coming up, and I hated that as a kid. I hated it. It made me so angry because it's so lame and it's so just tonally weird. It's just tacked on. And maybe I'll do like a separate video on it. But that's kind of my issue with Tolkien is I just feel he needs an editor. He needed someone to tell him no. He needed someone to cut his books down and be like, no, you can expand here, you can cut down here. I just feel like it's very, very self-indulgent the way he wrote these. And that just with a little more self-awareness, it could have been much better than it was. Like, I get that it's a classic. I get it that people love these books. They reread them all the time. But I'm saying this as someone who's enjoyed them, as someone who's liked them, but think they could have been so much better had they just made some slightly different creative decisions. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope I made some interesting points, and I'll talk to you guys again